Before the Kardashians and the Mormon housewives, there was a family that set the stage for reality TV as we know it today. They were a direct inspiration for MTV's The Real World and a template for what was to follow in family-centered reality TV shows. In today's video, we'll dive into the history of the first reality TV family in the United States, who they were, and how they shaped television culture. Let's talk about the 1971 series, An American Family. First, let's set the stage for the time period here. 1971 was a time when cars may have had seatbelts, but no airbags. Exotic animals could be sold, imported, and owned in your home with no regulations. Over-the-counter drugs were still not subject to rigorous review and standards. Asbestos, lead, chloroform, formaldehyde, and DDT were all regularly used in household products and materials. There was no federal limit to blood alcohol levels when driving, leaving instead the option of whether or not to set a limit to individual states. The Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, officially began operations in April of 1971, but sexual harassment in the workplace was not yet legally recognized as discrimination, and there were no legal protections in place for employees experiencing sexual harassment. Schools were still heavily segregated, and court-ordered busing of students was implemented in order to support integration. Redlining and discrimination towards people of color when applying for home loans was still a significant issue, despite the Fair Housing Act. The draft for the Vietnam War was still ongoing, and it wouldn't end until 1973. Women could not get credit cards in their own name, or loans, or mortgages, because banks required male co-signers. Many states had laws denying access to birth control for unmarried women, and doctors could even outright refuse to prescribe them either way. Most of the U.S. heavily restricted or outright banned abortion until 1973 with the Roe v. Wade decision. California, Iowa, and Colorado were the only states where you could obtain a no-fault divorce, which meant that you could divorce someone without having to obtain evidence of an affair, imprisonment, domestic abuse, mental illness, or failure to consummate the marriage. The divorce rate in 1971 was 29%. Up until 1976, there were no states in the U.S. that had laws against marital rape. Homosexuality was still considered a mental illness in the DSM-5 and was only removed in 1973. While it was considered a mental illness, gay people could be institutionalized against their will, fired from their jobs, or denied housing. New York introduced a proposal for a gay rights bill in 1971, but it wouldn't get passed until 1986. California and the USA generally had a long history of anti-sodomy laws, and these laws sometimes applied both to gay people and straight people, but were often applied at the will of police who would solicit sex in bathrooms, but mostly same-sex couples were targeted. The buying power equivalent of $1 in 1971 is $7.77 today, and according to census data, the median income for families in 1971 was $10,285, which is $79,900 today. The U.S. was experiencing something known as stagflation, which is a period of high inflation rates with high unemployment and very slow economic growth. Politically motivated bombings were at their peak. The city of Santa Barbara was no stranger to the political upheaval of the 70s, and in February of 1970, a UC Santa Barbara student sit-in at Perfect Park was met with extreme police brutality and ended with a Bank of America location being burned and damaged. The protest began as a result of Bank of America illegally giving loans to South African countries during apartheid. Ronald Reagan was in his second term as the governor of California. The most popular sitcoms on TV were All in the Family, The Brady Bunch, and The Partridge Family. Reality TV programming consisted of game shows like Truth or Consequences, The Newlywed Game, and The Dating Game, with the exception of Candid Camera, which was a prank show. Now, An American Family was a groundbreaking documentary series that aired in 1973 on PBS. The Loud family consisted of parents Bill and Pat Loud and their 5 children Lance, Kevin, Grant, Delilah, and Michelle. They were the first family to have their lives documented for television in this way, and they were followed by a camera crew for 7 months. The family had signed up to be in a documentary series about American families. The series was 12 one-hour episodes, and the framing device of the show was the knowledge that by the end, Pat and Bill Loud were divorced. The producer and the creator of the show, Craig Gilbert, wanted to follow an affluent Santa Barbara family to reveal truths about the concept of family in the U.S. and whether or not the idea of family was an outdated notion. Craig was going through a divorce at the time and dealing with his own notions of family contradicting one another. When he sold the show to PBS, he immediately went on a bender for several days before finally hiring his crew, Susan and Alan Raymond, as camera and sound. They're also credited as filmmakers. They'd worked together in the past on documentaries, including one detailing the work of anthropologist Margaret Mead. Craig interviewed 24 different families before eventually settling on the Loud family. Pat describes Craig's pitch to her this way in her book. He said he thought family life in the US was embattled, disappearing as a matter of fact, and he wanted to document it before it became completely obsolete. He thought if you followed a family around with cameras long enough and shot just what was happening, it was inevitable that, after a while, truths would start rising to the surface like dumplings. Craig told the Loud family that they would be one of 4 families filmed for the series, and the filming would take 2 weeks to complete. It actually took 7 months to complete. After filming began, Craig kept avoiding Pat and Bill when they wanted a firm timeline of filming and how long they would even be filming for. He would tell them that he was thinking of changing the series because of how well the Louds appeared on camera, and then he said he wanted to focus on them entirely because he felt like there was just so much to work with. Craig later claimed that he had told the family that he would be filming them for 7 months from the beginning, but that they simply didn't listen or want to understand. Pat Loud's book recounts several times when Craig would insist that the family agreed to something that they hadn't, and that they simply misunderstood or didn't listen. This was posted to the Loud Family Unshattered Instagram. And this was the only contract the family signed, written up by Craig Gilbert on the fly, after he told them that they would surely sign a more extensive contract later. They never did. Note the use of such exploitative language such as in perpetuity throughout the world. And this contract did hold up. A question that arose consistently in the criticism of the show was, why did they agree to it? Why would anyone agree to be filmed like this, and for so long? Here's what Pat Loud had to say in her book, A Woman's Story. Wouldn't anybody have done it, thinking it was going to be for 1 hour on educational television? Or even not thinking? Crowds gather around television crews everywhere. It's the old, "Hi Mom" syndrome. It seems to give people a kind of permanence or reality if they're on TV. I suppose because TV is the only other thing that goes on as much as life. It's something about how TV and the other media seem more real to us than our own excruciating lives. So maybe some of that nice, unreal reality would rub off on us too. The clue to what Craig actually wanted out of the whole thing came when later in an interview he said he'd decided against one of the families because they were already in therapy. Craig was going to be our guru. The first thing the crew filmed was a trip Pat Loud took to go see her eldest son, Lance, in New York. Lance was living in the Chelsea Hotel at the time, looking for work in New York City. He was 20. He took his mother and the cameras to see a drag show and then to go out dancing. It became the second episode of the series. It's one of the most well-known episodes because it includes a walk through Central Park where Pat and Lance discuss how Lance felt growing up, and he expressed that he felt stifled as a kid in Santa Barbara, and that he knew his parents didn't always know how to handle him and didn't understand him. Despite no explicit statements of Lance's sexuality, the scene is often referred to as Lance's coming out scene. Lance never felt the need to hide who he was on the cameras or generally in front of others, and his presence in the show was an inspiration for many gay people watching at the time, who did not see gay representation on TV, and especially not representation that wasn't intended as comedy. While what was being shown was controversial and groundbreaking for its time, much of what was said on camera was recognized as stunted communication between family members. For example, Lance expressed to his mother that he had no idea how to talk to his father or what to say, and his mother replied that his father was such a conversationalist that he'd do all the talking himself. Pat describes the second episode of An American Family, where she speaks to Lance in Central Park, as, "We wander through Central Park and endlessly fail to communicate, throwing out bits and beginnings to each other like bait, hoping the other will throw back a fish." This was fascinating to me because I did notice in the way that they spoke that there were interruptions, and that Lance would begin to say something about how he felt stifled as a child, but neither of them could really pick up where the other left off. I chalked it up to the atmosphere and the distractions of walking through the park, and also to the fact that there were no story producers there asking them to say that again or finish your thought. Watching the show, you can see such a huge difference between how reality TV is shot and edited today versus how this show was presented then. The concept behind filming An American Family was cinema verite, a style of documentary filmmaking that is observational and follows impromptu versus scripted action. As such, it really feels like you're sitting there watching a family go about their lives. The first episode in particular has many moments where family members are washing dishes, sitting around, talking about chores. And I will admit it was difficult to watch with those extended scenes of monotonous actions. In an episode of The Kardashians, for example, everything you see on screen contributes to a plotline of the episode with rising action, a climax, and falling action. But in an episode of An American Family, you'll watch the eldest daughter Delilah prepare for a dance rehearsal by actually sitting through the dance rehearsal, buying new tap shoes with her mother, getting ready and putting together the costume, and finally, watching an entire dance recital. Pat wrote in her book that with all the cameras around so often, they all became afraid of dull moments where they sat around doing nothing, which impeded them from actually reflecting or gaining insights. She said that you need moments of sitting around and smoking and staring into space to gain insights. But Pat says as much as they tried to avoid looking empty or boring, that they certainly came across that way to many people that watched the show. I do feel a little bad that I'm one of those people that felt like there were moments on the show that dragged on, but I'm also used to an entirely different style of filming and editing. The way An American Family was filmed is unheard of today because of how much time, money, and film was dedicated to recording events that never made it onto the show. It was 300 hours of film that was cut down to 12 hours. At the end of the second episode, Pat gets a tarot reading from Lance's roommate, Soren. The reading indicates a big change, and he says that she's got a big decision to make, and the reaction will set her back a bit, but she'll pass over it quickly. He says specifically, something is ending. She jokes that maybe the world is ending. If this was filmed today, it would have been a scene filmed last in order to make an effective foreshadowing scene for what's to come. But because this was filmed in 1971 and was all shot during that same New York trip that was filmed first, I think it was not intentional, but lucky and carefully picked from 300 hours of footage by a really detailed editor to contribute to the story. Pat wrote in her book that Craig Gilbert was one of the few men that she had been able to really talk to, who understood her in a way that no one else in Santa Barbara did. They often had long drinking sessions together and would reminisce about mutual friends. This is how they became so close, and how she would end up agreeing to the creation and filming of An American Family. Their closeness throughout filming concerned Alan and Susan Raymond, whose previous work with cinema verite-style filmmaking gave them the perspective that the closeness between Pat and Craig was too much of an influence on part of the filmmaking team and a contradiction to cinema verite. There was a movie made in 2011 about the Loud family filming this series that goes into the manipulation by Craig Gilbert and that also used Pat Loud's book to inform the script. The movie, however, implied that Pat and Craig had at one point a sexual relationship, even though it did imply it rather vaguely. Pat's book dispels the notion that she and Craig ever had more than a platonic relationship, but she does talk about feeling close to him and then feeling very betrayed when An American Family premiered. Episode 5 begins to show signs of strain and tension between Bill and Pat. After Michelle and Delilah return home from a vacation early, they find the house empty. Their father, Bill, was supposed to be home, but Delilah can't reach him even at his office. A wildfire is raging behind their house, and Michelle and Delilah are freaking out, so they call and tell their mom, who is still on vacation, that Dad isn't home and they don't know what to do. They get a police escort away from the home, and when Pat returns that next morning, Bill never offers up an explanation as to where he was that night. Pat and Bill go to a restaurant together, El Paseo, and Pat tells Bill, "I think the things that you do are shitty, and perhaps you think the things I do are shitty, but I think you're a goddamn asshole." And then the scene fades to black. There is no further context or explanation for this argument. Definitely no talking heads about how people felt. Alan and Susan Raymond have said that they felt that filming this argument may have been crossing a line and they didn't want to continue. Craig, however, was constantly asking them in meetings if Pat and Bill had fought yet. When Pat and Bill had agreed to film the show, they were both working off of the idea that they would be showcasing success, an ideal version of an American family, an affluent life in Santa Barbara where a successful businessman and his wife raised 5 children. But we know that the climax of this series and its framing device is the separation of Bill and Pat. And while it was sensational to attribute the separation to the filming of the show, the truth was more complicated. By the time the cameras arrived, Pat had threatened Bill with divorce 3 times. She had found evidence of multiple affairs that he'd engaged in while on business trips, and when she confronted Bill, he told her he didn't believe in monogamous marriage, and he preferred an open one. The year she met Craig Gilbert, Pat had already resigned herself to waiting until all 5 of her kids had gone to college before going through with leaving Bill. Pat Loud's book is such a detailed and emotional account of her changing ideas of family and her disillusionment with her own marriage. She writes, "Was it possible that people were not made to stick together all their lives? Could it be that even if you married somebody you loved very much, it might just somehow end, leaving you lost in space? Then what would you do? Could the whole thing, the whole American concept of marriage, be just totally unworkable, as Bill said? Was the whole concept of family wrong? And if so, how had societies managed all this time? Or was the world changing so fast that I couldn't keep up with it and Bill could? How come he was so smart?" But there was something deathly wrong in what Bill said. His view of open marriage, well, it was strangely like mine had been for years, except for the outside sex. We both had always seen marriage as 2 parallel lines, each doing their own thing. And parallel lines don't meet. Had my parents ever met? They hadn't really. But they hadn't seemed to mind. That was the huge difference. I suppose a more strong-minded woman would have ended it right there. Not only strong-minded, but fearless. I was like the millions of women in the world who have never done anything on their own, and I was terrified. How could I live? How could I make it with all those kids? Would any other man ever look at me, worn out, beat up frump that I was? Pat was terrified of leaving Bill and having to create a life of her own, but something happened as the filming went on. She became bolder. The surviving Loud children created a podcast this year, 2024, called The Loud Family Unshattered, where Grant Loud described the change he saw in his mother over the course of filming. Grant said that his mother started asserting herself more, and even throwing insults at his father in front of the kids, before eventually exploding on their dad. Kevin Loud also remembers that their dad was becoming more bold as well, and that he started flirting with women in restaurants at the table to make his mother mad. Pat described her feelings this way: "After you've played the same old marriage game for as long as we had, with both of you hitting the same foul balls and stealing the same old bases, your tolerance for the whole performance dwindles down to nothing. I hated myself so for my part in it. I was tired of goading and being goaded back. It was as though my whole being had been reduced to a mass of suspicion and hurting self-hatred and weary forced participation in this lousy play that should have closed long ago." But the series had another effect. We were living a story that had to be told, and the story was building up to a climax. It was just as Craig had said. The truths that were lurking under the surface were now ready to explode into view. Was this the therapy that was supposed to take place? Or Craig's urge to see a good fight, whether to make for a little drama, or purge his own rage about his own problems? God only knew. I just knew that now there was a stronger force pushing me to end the whole miserable mess more than there ever had been before. Pat felt more supported and less frightened with Craig and the filming crew around. She felt like she had people to catch her when she fell. They'd become very close. After the fight in El Paseo restaurant, she spoke to Craig about everything that had been going on with Bill. They hadn't spoken about the problems in her marriage before. Craig told her that Bill had taken him to Malibu to meet his mistress and see her headshots. In episode 6, we see Pat Loud discussing her upcoming separation from Bill with her brother and his wife. She talks about the affairs he carried on, how depressed she's felt, and how she felt too old for women's liberation but too young to stay in this unhappy marriage forever. She expressed a lot of vulnerability about the denial she felt at first when she learned of his affairs and how that festered into anger when Bill wouldn't even make an effort to hide his affairs from her. Her sister-in-law responded by telling Pat that maybe she should try to stick it out and work harder to keep the marriage together. Pat Loud discussed this episode in her book and how she had solidified the idea of the separation in her mind. I think when something drastic happens to you, you go right back to feeling the way you did during some other awful stage in your life. And that's what I did. I felt just the way I had at 13. Acne and frizzy hair and glasses and all of it. Really, the only thing that had levered me out of feeling that way was Bill. And when Bill went, back it all came. It was as though I hadn't really grown up during all those years. It took me a while to understand that one. If you hang on to somebody else the way I did, you don't grow up. She also clarified her comment about being too old for women's lib. She said that she wished guilt didn't eat at her so much when dating because she felt so many hang-ups, especially about sex, that men don't feel, and that she can't even be liberated the way men can because men didn't respect women who were free about sex. Pat talked about being enculturated to believe that nice girls knew nothing about sex, and that stuff like knowing different sex positions was frowned upon, but that she wanted to do more in exploring what felt good. But the men that she dated didn't like that, and it made her feel guilty all over again. Maybe if women are guilty about emasculating men, they're right. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe sexually aggressive women are simply too threatening for most men. But my God, then what do we do? If women's sexuality is really coming unleashed for the first time in ages, which I think it is, it's not going back where it came from without another revolution. And a lot of men in their middle years seem to be getting pale and sweaty in the face of the new miracles they're expected to perform at just the time when they're getting a little nervous about their masculinity anyway. She told the kids off camera and asked for that scene of her speaking to her brother to be off camera as well, but Craig and the camera crew showed up anyway. She got into a big fight with Craig about it. I said I hadn't agreed to let him film it, and he said I had, and my whole problem was I didn't listen when somebody talked to me, or apparently even to myself. And I really did want to do it, even though I thought I didn't. This surely does get confusing. And I said, Jesus, you're persuasive. And he got cross because he wasn't supposed to be persuading me to do anything. I think Craig really gaslit the shit out of Pat, and she lets him off easy here. He even got angry with her when she told him that he was persuading her because he knows that he's been going against his own filming philosophy. In episode 8, the narrator tells us that Grant Loud has been tasked with picking his father up at the airport and taking him to a hotel room instead of bringing him home. His mother had asked him to tell his father that he wouldn't be coming home, essentially asking Grant to be the one to tell his father that his mom was asking for a divorce. The camera crew filmed Grant and his father in the car, with Grant nervously trying to ask his father if maybe he'd been able to get in contact with his secretary, who also knew, but Bill hadn't gotten that message, and Grant couldn't go through with it. So he took his father home, much to the surprise of his mother and the rest of the family. This is when the divorce scene plays out, with Pat realizing Bill has no idea what she's about to do, and Pat simply handing over her lawyer's business card saying, "I've contacted a lawyer and I'd like a divorce." Pat wrote about the immense task that she put on Grant to tell his father not to come home, and said, "I suppose that's too heavy a message for a sensitive kid to carry, but I think Bill knew." Considering Grant talks about this 50 years later on the podcast, I think it's obvious Grant expected more than just an acknowledgement. Grant said in the podcast that his mother and him never sat down to talk about what happened, how he had failed her in his eyes, and how it had made him feel. Something special about the Loud Family Unshattered podcast is that when Grant recounts this emotional moment, he receives a lot of support from his siblings about it. They all agreed that it was too much to ask of him. The final 2 episodes of the show are centered around Bill and Pat. We see Bill discussing alimony payments with his lawyer and speaking to Lance about how much he loved his mother, but didn't regret the separation. We see Pat speaking to new friends about her fear of living independently and her need to do something with her life rather than sit at home. In the final episode, we also hear Lance talk about how he feels like he has no real goals or ambitions in life for success, and he doesn't understand what drives people. It's a very existential, self-conscious rambling that, for me, adds up to someone who's unsure of their passions and has a lot of self-doubt. This was a conversation that was twisted by critics to mean he was just some kind of leech on his parents, but just watching the show and listening to him interact with his parents, you can tell how much they love him and they just want him to be okay. Bill even has a conversation with a friend about marriage, and his friend asks if Lance was ever a problem in his marriage. And Bill doesn't even hesitate. He says no way. He thinks that Lance could be a con man or a great salesman based on how his personality attracts people to him, but he also says that Lance does his best in everything he does. The series ends with Pat telling her friends that she doesn't think she'll get married again. Pat expected the series to be a rebirth for her, and in a lot of ways it was, but the criticism of the show was an entity unto itself. Pat wrote in her book that she thanks God that Craig had a Christian conscience, otherwise he would have manipulated Pat into feeding Bill poisoned meatballs and convinced her he had nothing to do with it. I think that this shows how manipulated she truly felt by him, even if she did present this as kind of a dark joke. I'm going to read some excerpts now of criticism that the show and the Loud family received. The Louds have an innocence which is truly staggering. What they had signed was no less than a genuine Faustian pact with the camera's eye. Far from seeing it as their destroyer, the Louds came to regard it as an eerie sort of family friend. It helped those 7 stranded souls feel a little closer together. The show strikes me as a genuine American tragedy, a glimpse into the pit. These nice-looking people act like affluent zombies. Their shopping carts overflow, but their minds are empty. They are barely articulate. They embrace but do not feel, or are unable to communicate what they feel, or even to identify with it. If passion is absent, image is all. The awful silence of the Loud family is deafening. A lot of the criticism was very homophobic and criticized the Loud family for raising Lance, a troubled man whose issues were the result of being born wrong and somehow led to Bill's cheating. The New York Times Magazine published a major essay about the Louds, An American Family, Things Are Keen But Could Be Keener, written by Anne Royf. Anne wrote, "The patient viewer begins to absorb these people, their culture. Their level and kind of civilization is exposed as clearly as if it were under a microscope." The piece's worst sting, however, came from Royf's analysis of Lance, whom she described as the evil flower of the Loud family. Even for 1973, Anne Royf's essay was virulently homophobic. Long sections deride Lance's flamboyant, leech-like homosexuality, his camping and queening about like a pathetic court jester, a Goya-esque emotional dwarf. Royf theorized at length what caused Lance, concluding that he'd been born damaged, like swimming alongside an electric eel. She even theorized that Bill's cheating had somehow been Lance's fault. The publicity sheet for the show's premiere and press screenings was also fairly scathing in its review of the content. They could be the Jaredol couple. He's handsome, charming, sexy, a good talker. She's beautiful and elegant, with legs a 20-year-old might envy, and a kind of total calm. But he never says, "Honey, you're incredible." In fact, he seldom speaks to her directly. From the first breakfast scene of An American Family, you sense that he's not going to keep her, or rather, that these two decorative people lost each other a long time ago. Nothing like this has ever been done before. Gilbert's expressed aim in the film is both simple and enormously ambitious, to illuminate a distinctively American condition, explore the doubts, fears, pressures, hopes that unite us all. They're not typical, Gilbert says. Not average. No family is. But most viewers will experience the shock of recognition. There we are, and our friends and neighbors. The Louds are perhaps more affluent than most, 3 cars in the garage and Cornish hens in the pot. But the easy assumption of plenty is recognizably American middle class. And yes, of course, they have a pool. Flying, partying, quarreling, just talking, the Louds reveal a peculiarly American faith in simple solutions. Instant cure. Unhappy? Take a trip. Lonely? Give a party. Set your hair. Pat's instinct in crisis is to reach for a drink. The breakdown of communications, so striking in the Loud family, is perhaps a typically American disease, the result of disproportionate emphasis on maintaining surfaces, keeping cool. These people touch without meeting, meet without touching. Like most families, the Louds avoid unpleasantness. On these rare occasions when one individual, desperate, proposes show and tell, the rest play hide and seek. Nothing embarrassing, nothing uncomfortable will be said. Since the rules of the game are clear, family members speak in private code. But perhaps nothing is more fascinatingly of this time and place than the Louds' willingness to be filmed. All those private humiliations and despairs photographed in living color, why did they do it? Some explanations are obvious. Flattery. A national audience for one's ordinary activities, proving they're not so ordinary after all. Hope of being discovered. The Louds themselves, evidently, hoped the camera might circumvent their usual difficulties in communicating so that they could exchange, on film, revelations impossible in face-to-face encounters. Gilbert seems to have approached his subject without preconceptions. I didn't set out to prove anything. I had faith that if we stayed with a family long enough, certain universals would surface, like how parents feel about children and how husbands feel about wives. Gilbert doesn't editorialize. Though naturally he makes the most of dramatic contrast, nothing about the editing gives one sense of being manipulated. The series begins with a post-separation New Year's Eve party, then flashes back to June. So the question becomes, what went wrong? What does it mean? As the camera searches for answers, the fault is everyone's and no one's. Something remarkable happens to the viewer. He finds himself thinking not just about the Louds, but about families in general, and about himself. Pat was furious at the publicity sheet created for the show and its view on how uncommunicative and distant the Louds were. She demanded to Craig that he stop giving these publicity sheets to press, and he agreed, and then mailed them to press instead. Pat said that she knew this publicity sheet would set the tone for the rest of the critiques to follow, and she was right. Many of the same phrases popped up again, like, they meet without touching, touch without meeting. Pat wrote that she was astounded that an educational channel, PBS, was treating the publicity of an American family so sensationally. Reading her book, and especially Pat's feelings of the press surrounding an American family and the perception of her family, really reminds me of how difficult it is to tell anyone's story, your own, your family's, anybody else's. Everyone will have something different to say, and practically no one will agree. Pat wrote about the family's decision to do interviews. We were getting more and more frightened of what was happening. We had no control, no importance. We weren't people. We were public targets to take potshots at. What was filmed was more real than you were. So was what was written about you. It felt so valid and significant, those words on paper, those people on that little screen, that it became part of you and changed you a little bit into what they said you were. What nerve have we touched? Why has an American family become the hit of the public television season? I would like to know. If we can find some answers to these questions, the question, why we did it, will fade into unimportance. The fact is, I don't know why we did it. We really believed, so help me, that by letting all of us hang out, we might help to free some pent-up soul out there. It didn't work out. Not as sociology, nor as a bargain. We didn't succeed from our end, nor did the editing and publicity given the series merit our trust or offer much in the way of enlightenment. I find myself shrinking in defense not only from critics and detractors, but from friends, sympathizers, and finally, myself. The reviews have been hit and run scornful, not of the series, which seems to have scored as a spectacle, but of the Loud family. The treatment of us as objects and things instead of people has caused us wildly anxious days and nights. I have wished it undone many times and yelped in anguish that I never would do it again. But I would. In fact, if I could just be sure that it did what the producers said it was supposed to do. If we have failed, was it because of the family, the editing, the lurid publicity, any or all of these, or because public television just doesn't educate? And if it can't educate, what can it do? Or finally, did we, family and network alike, serve up great slices, irretrievable slices of ourselves only to entertain briefly, to titillate, and then diminish into nothing? The Loud family decided to go on several TV shows for interviews after these critiques came in, and while the intention was to set the record straight, there was a response to their continued television appearances that audiences felt as if the Louds were simply extending their time on TV. One of their most famous appearances was on The Dick Cavett Show. Lance spoke frankly about being gay to Dick Cavett, and about how he felt like he came across as obnoxious on the show. Lance also said that the preconceptions people had did wear on him for a long time. But there were also positive experiences that came from the public reception of An American Family. Anthropologist Margaret Mead praised the series as the launch of a new genre, as important for our time as were the invention of drama and the novel for earlier generations, a new way to help people understand themselves. There was an outpouring of letters that came after the Louds' appearance on The Dick Cavett Show, and it was a huge relief to Pat. They were honestly so beautiful to read as well, considering how deeply the show was able to touch some people who were privately going through intense life moments, just like the Louds' divorce, that felt seen and validated through the show. One of the letters to Pat read, "One of the things women have always done was deprive themselves all their lives for the sake of their family, and to the detriment of themselves. Seeing my own parents' lack of communication, yours and countless other people, not to mention the world leaders of our day, I hope I can avoid some of the problems that come up when two people have an intimate relationship. How are you managing with your feelings? Mine are so confusing, I really don't know how I survive from day to day. I was married, it would have been 25 years on May 15th of this year, and I ended up a divorcee after 20 years of marriage. I feel like a complete failure of a woman. All I really have are my children, and at times I get angry with them. I wish I could somewhere find a man who would really love me as the person and not a sex object, which is since 2 to 3 years now is all men see in a woman. I met a fella named Redacted, and I went to hell, literally. For 7 weeks I went to dances and ended up having breakfast with him and parking and even sex. How I hate myself, Pat. What in the world possessed me? All I can see is a 49-year-old mess of a woman." Another letter read, "My husband and I are separated. You're right, we're too old for women's lib. My son Neil is your Grant. The kids are confused about us, themselves, and the whole damn world. If we decide to become women alone, why must we explain to so many? Your private feelings for Lance are also nobody's damn business. Forsaking your child because he's not what you dreamed he would be is unthinkable. Many women admire you enormously on this point alone." Another letter was from a particularly self-aware audience member. "Now all the pain and questions from a society of people in family agonies are flowing across your threshold. You are not so much in question as the whole of family life in general. And yet you must feel that all this delving is digging personally into you and yours. I empathize with you. If I delve emotionally into your life, it is more to understand myself and those around me than to criticize you." There was this huge unspoken weight on divorcees in the 1970s who were brimming with emotion and shared with Pat their own intense feelings and insecurities about separation and their own self-worth. Pat also received a letter from Jane Greenawalt, who had participated with her family in the 1971 CBS documentary special, But What If the Dream Comes True? The documentary followed the Greenawalt family as it explored how families in an affluent neighborhood of Birmingham, Michigan, were still afflicted with family issues and struggle. The Greenawalt family received similar backlash, especially for scenes like their daughter suggesting that she might take drugs one day, depending on what her high school experience was like. They were a wealthy white family living next to Detroit and were fairly isolated from the crime, poverty, and racial tensions of its neighboring city. While Pat and the Loud family received criticism for being a broken family and for accepting a camera crew into their home in the first place, much of the hateful criticism by the American public was aimed at Lance Loud. He was the first openly gay man on TV and did not attempt to hide his personality or sexuality in his public life. He went on to be a musician as lead singer of the Mumps, even performing at CBGB's with opening acts like the Talking Heads. Later he went on to journalism and wrote for Interview Magazine, Details, striking up a lifelong friendship with Andy Warhol. His siblings discussed on their podcast how Lance felt a huge responsibility when the response to the show was so strong. There were many gay people that wrote to him about how they felt seen because of him and called him an icon. His siblings have said that they felt that that was a big burden to Lance, who really was still searching for his passion in life, and it felt like he was being narrowly presented as just his sexuality. Lance asked Susan and Alan Raymond to come back and film him in his final days with his family in 2001 after being given a heavy prognosis of Hep C and HIV, only with a few months to live. Lance felt that at the end of An American Family, the Louds were portrayed as at a crossroads and depicted like a broken family. Together with the Raymonds, Lance created the TV special Death in an American Family, documenting his final days and his family's thoughts on life after their show. The TV special is heart-wrenching, and while the Loud family was at first extremely hesitant and skeptical of putting their lives on camera again, Lance's desire to share a conclusion with the world that was written on their terms is something I can empathize with. In Death in an American Family, Pat discusses how everyone in the family was aware from very early on that Lance was gay, but that he was more than that, and that they loved him regardless. Bill is also interviewed, and despite saying in one early interview from the 80s that he despises Lance's lifestyle and has no sympathy for it, in a 2002 interview after Lance's death, he says he wishes he had been more sensitive towards him. It's so clear how much both of his parents loved him. Death in an American Family is a really touching memorial and a tribute to Lance Loud. The Loud family opened the door to cameras for 7 months, and in that time, each member of the family struggled to express their thoughts, feelings, and struggles in a way that didn't actually reveal their inner selves. It was a balancing act that never truly balanced, and rather set everyone on edge and revealed more tensions than existed before filming. It was a blend of reality and fiction that exists in the same space as getting to know someone in person does, because the masks that we put forth to present ourselves to others exist outside of film. There was also the same innocence of early reality TV where the lack of informed consent affected the way the subjects performed. The intentions expressed by the Loud family as to why they agreed to be filmed seem less important than the reasons why Craig Gilbert chose to make the show with the Loud family. So much of the criticism aimed at the Louds centered around the vanity of allowing cameras into the home. Considering that they were told this was a documentary with multiple families, and that there really weren't examples of this kind of show at the time, I think they deserve more benefit of the doubt. There's an Andy Warhol quote that I think fits in well here. "You'll be famous for 29 minutes, but you'll also be demeaned, vilified, and eventually dismissed. A lot of people are going to recognize more of themselves in you than they're willing to admit, and they'll never forgive you for that." In the decades since, we've seen the celeb reality type shows featuring famous families like the Kardashians, the Osbournes, the Irwins, the D'Amelios, and the goal of those shows has been to display a down-to-earth side of these celebrities. The results have been mixed in many cases, with shows like The Newlyweds granting Jessica Simpson a kind of familiarity with her fans that was a direct result of that goal being met, whereas shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians have been on for so long that, and with so many iterations, that while the initial seasons may have offered a down-to-earth perspective, the later seasons and spin-off shows have kind of degraded any goodwill and authenticity. A consistent result of reality TV shows with a soap opera component, like the aforementioned family-centered shows, is a blending of someone's real life with scripted elements that don't always remain fictitious. Fake drama becomes real drama. It's a quote by Holly Madison that I applied in my previous video on reality TV that also applies here. Creating arguments or emotional scenes for the sake of a story in reality TV environments often just blurs the lines between fact and fiction. There's also the matter of the producer's intentions when creating a show centered on a specific family. For Craig Gilbert, he sought out to document the changing attitudes around the American idea of family and did everything in his power to capture what he viewed as the dissolution of the American family. The Loud children, now adults, have a completely different idea of their family, and they discussed it on their Unshattered podcast. The concept of the podcast was to revisit An American Family, but without the framing of PBS, Craig Gilbert, or anyone else but the Loud family. They discussed how the family became much closer after their parents' divorce, and remain close today. Bill and Pat Loud have since passed, as well as the eldest son, Lance Loud. The remaining Loud siblings, Kevin, Grant, Delilah, and Michelle, had very insightful discussions of the show on their podcast, and it was truly a pleasure to listen to this family reminisce about their closeness and discuss their struggles so candidly. There was something special there where I can see how someone could be drawn in and possibly see themselves And I can see how maybe the ire directed at them was exactly how Warhol said it, people recognizing parts of themselves and never forgiving them for it. Craig Gilbert was the first of many producers who shaped the stories of reality TV families for an audience. And even though his career ended with An American Family, he left a legacy for his successors. It's become pretty commonplace for people who've been on TV, scripted and unscripted, to create rewatch podcasts where they comment on the background and creation of the show and then its influence in the following years. The Osbournes, for example, have a podcast where they talk about their show, their lives today, and whatever they feel like discussing that day. Many of the people who have participated in reality TV shows about their personal lives have stated that there was a strong desire in them afterwards to set the record straight or pull the curtain back after the show revealed itself as kind of a cheap imitation of the people in it. Film doesn't evolve like people do, and when you add into that very purposeful and even manipulative editing, I can only imagine the distress that places on the subjects. I believe An American Family and the Louds themselves are an important part of American television history that over time has faded, but they set the stage for an entire industry that now operates with so many standards and tropes that truly did not exist when the Louds were being filmed. I want to know what you think. Have you ever heard of An American Family? Did you know that reality TV had origins going back this far? If you enjoyed learning about the first reality TV family, please consider leaving a comment or subscribing and coming back for more. You can watch episodes of An American Family and the subsequent TV follow-up specials in the link in my description. I also recommend reading the books Cue the Sun by Emily Nussbaum and Pat Loud's memoir, Pat Loud, A Woman's Story. They have a lot of information and some incredible storytelling. Thank you all for being here, and I will see you again soon. Have a great day.